Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have a very special guest because it's anonymous. We have to keep this undercover because I believe he's probably not even an adult yet. And what happened was I got a call from somebody. And so this guy in Walnut Creek who does this environmental thing, he said, there's a high school kid that wants to interview you for some kind of project that they're doing. I don't know too much about it. We're going to find out about it. And I am getting interviewed by somebody that went to Northgate High School in Walnut Creek, which are the Bronchos. And I know about that because I went there. Probably like 10 of my family members went to Northgate. And so Northgate's in Walnut Creek, California. I did go to 3 different high schools. So that is the one that I went to the longest. So welcome to the show, anonymous high school senior.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How's it going?
It's going well. So let me just start off with, what's your name, of course?
My name is Sean White, and you're on Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast.
All right, so let me start with my first question. How did you get into this subject of like renewable energy in life, and how do you like find out that this is something that you might want to study in the future?
That's a good question. And especially people that aren't older, so like younger people that are in their 30s and stuff like that, a lot of times it could be their first career. But when I was in Northgate and when I got out of Northgate and I got out of college, the solar industry was just, they would say, 2 hippies in a pickup truck. And it was very small. There wasn't that much going on. And so I got into it a little bit later, like not right out of college, like a lot of people. And the way that I got into it is my best friend at the time, his name is Paul Finn. He's still a good friend of mine, but he moved to Boston area or to Massachusetts, I should say. And he wrote a law. He was a philosopher. And he said, instead of writing books, I'm going to write laws because he's just like the crazy philosopher guy that shaved half his head and half his beard while he was studying insanity and all this stuff. But he was super smart. He got all these honors and stuff. And I met him at Governor Jerry Brown's house before he was mayor. And he had this organization called We the People. And we would just go there and talk philosophy and do Tai Chi and all this fun stuff. And he was writing these laws that had to do with solar and renewable energy. And we lived in Canyon, where I grew up, in this really cool place in the Redwoods, just a little bit east of Oakland. And we would sit around the campfire and play guitars, and he would bring people over, and we would go visit people. And I'd go to city council meetings and stuff with him. And I watched his law take off. And so the last time I checked, I know it's well over 10% of the country get their electricity through community choice aggregation. I believe it's most of California. And pretty much what the CCA does, the community choice aggregation, is it decouples purchasing the electricity from the poles and the wires and the billing. So what happens where a lot of people in California are living is they are still getting their bill from, like, for you and I, it would be PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. But then they also get their electricity through the CCA. It gets purchased through somebody that's contracting with a municipality, and it always tends to be greener and cheaper. So it's kind of a cool thing. And I just got into solar by that. I saw that he was doing all this cool stuff in the 90s, and I started researching the technical aspects of it because he was more of a policy guy, and I was looking at the technical stuff because I had more of a science background. And then I took some classes in Solar Living Institute, Diablo Valley College, and then I studied harder than anyone. And I still study. I still study like 12 hours a day. By noon, I'd already studied for 7 hours. But for me, studying is working because I'm writing curriculum and books and stuff like that. And that's kind of how it happened. I didn't know that I was going to get into teaching right off the bat. I started off working, besides, working for my friend and doing a little bit of technical research. My first full-time job in the industry was for a company called Fidelity Roof Company. And myself and this guy named Stuart Wentworth, who became really successful, invented a flashing called Quick Mount. Him and I were the solar guys at Fidelity Roof Company. And that only lasted about a year because pretty soon I was teaching across the country and I was too busy to go into work. So,
Oh, okay. So I definitely got a big background of you with that. So this can lead me on to my next question, which is, what are a couple little things people can do in their life to introduce more use of renewable energy?
So what can like your average
Yeah,
person
what can an
do?
average person do to increase their use of renewable energy? What do you think people can do in their day-to-day lives to possibly get that more in their lifestyle?
Yeah, so for one thing is to, work in the industry. That's a ton. Like that's a lot. To get solar on your roof, maybe to even learn how to put solar on your roof. In fact, the guy that introduced me to you, I think is Bob Joe, or is it Joe Bob? I can never get.
It's Bob something.
Yeah, Bob Joe, Bob Joe, and real nice guy. But what he did something that was really cool, and he has a straw bale house in Walnut Creek, and he's part of the Walnut Creek Environmental Group, and he did like an Eventbrite event at his house, which was installing solar at his house. And so he
Oh,
was really smart because he got people to actually pay to put solar on his house. And so then he hired me too. So I came and I was like overseeing it. And then there was just like these people are going like, whoa, what's solar all about? It's kind of cool. And then we put solar on his house. And so that was a really cool way of doing it. And something else that's really cool right now too, and I'm trying to promote is that there's used solar now. We didn't really see used solar because there was just so little. I mean, we saw it, but it was just like, it's a trophy you put on your wall or
you
something.
said used solar?
Yeah, used solar.
What does
So
that
like
mean?
that means that I've got a guy that lives out in Canyon that's a friend of mine, and he went to the junkyard and he just got all these free or almost free solar modules. I call them
Oh,
modules, solar panels. And I've got a couple of different people that have just given me stuff. So I'm also the president of NorCal Solar, which is a 51-year-old nonprofit organization that promotes solar. So I get some phone calls through NorCal Solar, and people are like, "What do I do with this old system?" I'm like, "Give it to me." So I'm working on starting a solar training center also out in Canyon. So it's going to be cool.
yeah, that's pretty cool.
And so some people are just like learning and doing it themselves. And of course, you don't want to get shocked, but you were just kind of like asking me like what people can do to make a difference. And that's learning about it if you maybe you wanted to get in the industry too and get some experience. But people that have like regular jobs and stuff like that, it's like find a company. I recommend finding them yourself and going off of referrals from people that have had experiences with the companies instead of just some random person. And you can also look people up on the NABCEP website. That's nabcep.org. And they have a certified locator, and they can find certified people that are really good at installing solar and all that kind of stuff. And so those are some other good ways of doing it, but there's a whole lot of different ways people can get involved. I mean, there's the basic recycling, and I think that sometimes people, even with recycling it, it's like there's other things that you could do that are like hundreds of times more important than
Yeah.
recycling. There's, like I said, putting solar on your roof. There's like driving an electric vehicle. There's making investments in the right places. So you look at the stock market and you might have some kind of mutual fund and it might be investing in some company that's doing something that's totally against what you believe in. So go look and just pay attention to what
Yeah.
your investments are,
So
you
awareness
know?
for sure.
Yeah, awareness.
So, here, another question I have is, what is a big advancement in renewable energy that could speed up its widespread adoption? Because right now it seems like people know about it. People are starting to buy more cars that are electric. I'm just wondering, what do you think is one big thing that is either like coming up or has already been invented that you think is really going to speed this process up of getting more people to use renewable energy?
So essentially, you're asking like what we need to do to speed up the adoption of renewables.
I mean, not necessarily like what big advancement have you
Hmm.
noticed that can speed up the widespread adoption?
Yeah, and I kind of think that we are actually doing it. So one of the things about living during the time of something happening is it just looks like day to day, and it's like, well, yesterday and tomorrow, they're not too different. But if you zoom out and you go like last year and next year, or 10 years ago and 10 years in the future, those differences are crazy. Like the growth is crazy growth. It's exponential growth. So we are getting there. The hard part, and we got to kind of give it to the Germans, is they invested in renewables when they didn't pay for themselves. And we had solar systems that were $10 a watt 20 years ago, or maybe a little bit more. Maybe the whole system was $10 a watt. And now the system is, in a lot of places, less than $1 a watt. In the United States, it's a lot more just because we have a lot of bureaucracy and tariffs, all that kind of stuff. But in a lot of places, like you go to Australia or something like that, it's like you can put solar on your roof for $1 a watt. If you do it yourself with used PV modules, it could be less than $1 a watt. Utility scale, like the large scale PV, less than $1 a watt. And another thing too that we need to do is we need to be really active. And we're in California. There's an organization called CALSA. And so they're really involved in lobbying the government to make the policies better. And one of the things that's happened is the Public Utility Commission in California is really hit hard on residential solar. And they have made it so you can't have net metering where you export for full credit. And I know that it's not going to always be that way where you export for full credit, but they changed it suddenly. They went from like getting full credit to getting just like a little bit for exporting. And what our policymakers need to do is they need to make policy changes in steps or gradually instead of just suddenly changing something like fivefold. Like say your credit for exporting, it's less than a fifth of what it was before this one day where they just changed everything. And so I believe it put something like 14,000 people out of work in California suddenly. And this has to do not with national politics, it has to do with state politics. And a lot of people too, when they look at the industry, they are looking at things on different levels. Like they look at the local, the state, the federal, and the whole world. And if you look at the whole world, it's growing like crazy. If you look at, just little segments, they call it the solar coaster. It goes up and it goes down. And I know you're also interested in just plain old renewables. So
Mhm.
energy storage, that's a huge thing right now because we have so much success with our solar energy. We need to do something with it because the sun doesn't shine all the time, and it also helps stabilize the grid. And then another thing is wind is important too.
Yeah, so you kind of just touched up on my next question, actually, which is how does the intermittency of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar affect the reliability, and are there any solutions to the issue?
Yeah, and so we have different intermittencies, of course, with solar and wind. And so solar will peak out in the middle of the day. And they call something the duck curve because it's kind of shaped like a duck when you look at the graph. In the
Yeah.
middle of the day, there's a lot of sun. So that's like the back of the duck. And we don't have this big demand for electricity. And worst case scenario is we don't have any place to put it. So we just kind of like turn it down a little bit, and that's not a problem, but it's better to save it. They're working on long duration energy storage and batteries. Any kind of energy storage helps with that. And also coordinating the usage of electricity. We call that loads. Loads are things that use electricity, like charging your electric vehicle. And then in the evening is the head of the duck, because as the sun is setting, people are coming home. They're still at Northgate High School. They're at work and everything. And then that's the biggest demand. And so electricity prices can also be like time of use where they're more expensive in the evenings. Wind can help offset that somewhat because wind isn't all about middle of the day like solar. Another thing that can help offset that is great big long transmission lines. So the sun is coming up 3 or 4 hours different times between if you're on the West Coast and the East Coast and things like that. There's even plans to have a cable that goes pretty much around the world from Argentina to South Africa, which is kind of crazy, across the Bering Straits, which would be really super cool, but I don't think politically that something like that's going to happen. Plus, we do have the technology and there's plenty of it. The materials are there. We have plenty of, materials to make solar PV modules, batteries, and all the electronics. And it's really good for technology, creating jobs, and all that kind of stuff too. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Shaun White is sponsoring his own podcast. And he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
So speaking on like the materials made or used for solar panels and wind turbines, do you think that there will ever be a way for us to still be able to get energy from obviously the sun and wind without using as many harmful materials that we have to get by mining?
Yeah, so if you look at the solar module, it is very inert. Like a lot of people think like, oh, because it's technology, it's going to be really toxic and all that kind of stuff. And there are ways to use toxic materials to make solar, but most of our solar is made with crystalline silicon. Silicon, of course, is like the computer chip too. It's pretty much the same thing. It's a diode, it's a p-n junction, and it is the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust. Do you take chemistry class in Northgate?
I mean, I took it 2 years ago. Yeah.
You might be surprised to find out. Do you know the first most abundant element in the Earth's crust?
Crust. Is it carbon?
It's oxygen.
Oxygen.
Yes, and it's kind of crazy because it's the thing that we breathe. So
Hmm.
oxygen is the most abundant thing in the Earth's crust, but that's a good guess too, because there's carbon too, especially in the part of the Earth's crust where things grow. So we have the carbon cycle and the plants and the trees and all that. So if you just go to your backyard, it could be there's a lot more carbon there and hydrogen and stuff like that. But like if you just look at like a rock, like down, it's going to be like lots of silicon and oxygen, some iron, and all those types of things. So there's tons of silicon. There's silicon in our bodies. It's like some people take it as a supplement, and silicon doesn't occur in its pure form naturally, so we have to refine it. And so it looks sort of like glass after it's refined, and then they slice it up really thin and do a couple of different things to it, and that's what's capturing those sun rays. So there's plenty of it. We're not running out of it. We also use glass and aluminum, and there's alternatives to doing that kind of stuff, a little bit of silver. And, it's not crushing the silver prices and making silver prices go up like gold or something like that. There seems to be a lot of it. Copper is another thing, and there's a little bit in the solar module itself, but, just wiring a building, getting the electricity to go from one place to another. So we have plenty of that. But with the batteries, it's a little bit different story. And with batteries, though, for energy storage, mostly we're using something called lithium iron phosphate, LFP. It's a type of a lithium ion battery. And lithium is very abundant in the universe. It doesn't look like we're going to run out. It's in the seawater. We usually do mine for it, though. Just like, about anything, copper mining, there's a lot, everything's kind of mined for. But lithium's not toxic. It's actually a medicine. Your pharmacy has lithium. You could buy lithium pills on Amazon. And then iron, so LFP, lithium iron phosphate, of course, there's tons of iron. It's just like it's all over. It makes steel. In fact, the Earth by weight is more iron than anything else, but most of that iron is in the core. We got this inner core that's solid iron, the outer core that's just molten. And so there's a lot of iron in Earth, but it sinks a lot of it too. Mars is red because of iron. And so there's lots of iron. And then phosphorus, lithium iron phosphate. So phosphorus, there's a lot of phosphorus around too. So it's not anything that we're going to run out of. In fact, it's essential. It's an essential element for life. So there's lots of phosphorus, and those things are not going to kill us. In fact, if you thought about it, lithium, it's not essential, but it's like a medicine. Iron, it's essential. It's like hemoglobin in your blood. Phosphorus, it's in your DNA. So all of those things, they're not toxic. It's not going to kill you. But there are different kinds of lithium ion batteries. And the one that might be in your car, if you have a car that's, with a long range battery, and a lot of this is changing too. A lot of places are switching over to the lithium iron phosphate, and they call it LFP, F for ferrous is iron, is called NMC. That's a popular one for cars that have the longer range batteries. And that's NMC, lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt oxide. So we've got manganese abundant, and then oxide abundant, lithium abundant, and so nickel pretty abundant. We just need to stop making all those coins, like we're not running low on nickel or anything like that. But the one thing that's a conflict material, sort of, is cobalt. And so cobalt isn't necessarily toxic. I mean, some people say they have cobalt allergies and stuff like that. Like they were putting it in like artificial hips, but I think they're stopping to do that. Some people react to it and stuff like that. But the biggest problem with cobalt is half the cobalt in the world is in this place in Africa called the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not democratic. And they have a lot of problems there, and one of them being child labor, so putting kids to work in the mines. And so that's a big concern, and it's in your phone because one of the things that they're using that cobalt for is if you want your battery to take up less space, that's good for your phone. That's called the volume, you know?
Yeah.
And then also to be not as heavy, they call that specific energy. So there's energy density, that's volume, and specific energy, that is weight. And so the weight is kind of more important for the batteries, unless you're talking about your phones. But anyway, cobalt gets you a little extra. And so that is one of the things that is a problem. And so we're recycling the batteries or we're just switching to LFP. And it's not so bad. And I would say too that as technology gets better, like you might say that the LFP of today might be as good as the NMC of a decade ago, something like that. Plus, they're always inventing new things. But one thing I should warn people about is to always be a little bit skeptical of some new thing that comes out that's going to change everything. You know,
Yeah.
like we've always had this with like, there's this new kind of solar, it's going to change everything. We've had that for like 40 years. It's going to be part of your roof and, and stuff like that. And it's like, there's applications for some of these new things, but it doesn't just completely change the industry. And with batteries too, it's like there's a lot of room for batteries to get better, and they will get better, but it's just one step at a time. Just like how I want those incentives for solar, like tax credits and net metering and things, I like them to like change just small steps instead of suddenly. And just in natural nature with the economy, we're not going
Mhm.
to see like some new technology that's going to change the whole industry, all that kind of stuff. And so the way that I see it, it's not really all this toxic stuff. I mean, if you want to talk about the toxic stuff, look at the other ways of making electricity. And I almost don't even need to say it.
Yeah, that actually leads me to another question, which is how helpful is the use of renewable energies on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and how do they compare to other climate change solutions such as nuclear energy?
Yeah, so that is a hot topic in the industry. Like, should we do nuclear? And I would say, like, maybe half the people in the solar industry are for it, the other half are against it. And I have my own personal opinions, and I try to be a little bit more neutral as far as like I do a lot of training, and I don't want to just pick sides and things like that. But of course, things like solar have gone down so much in price. It's the cheapest electricity in the world. It's easy to build up. You even see, like, no matter who's president, solar is growing. And why is it doing that? Is because the economics. At first, it wasn't the economics. I was talking about Germany and the incentives and stuff, but the economics of solar are the best. And wind is also very competitive with solar. And so you mentioned nuclear. And one of the things about nuclear is it takes a really long time to build. So nuclear takes a long time to build. Nuclear is something that you have to worry about. Like you brought up toxic. So like, I don't want to live at 3 Mile Island. Do you? I don't know. But it is a very green solution. I mean, anytime you're doing solar or nuclear, you are going to have to, people are driving a truck to work or something. So there is some sort of fossil fuel. They're mining for uranium. They're putting the uranium waste into Yucca Mountain or something like that. And I always worry too about like what happens 10,000 years from now. I mean, it's like 10,000 years BC, they were inventing farming or whatever in Mesopotamia. But what happens that far in the future if we're burying all this stuff? And it's like, how long are those barrels going to last? And I know that some people in the nuclear industry get really upset about that to just bring it up. but I think it's good to just have the conversation. I know some people say that there's new technologies where you could take that nuclear waste and then use it for fuel until there's nothing left of it.
Yeah.
And so that's a good one, but it does, it does make green energy. And so what's the trade-off there? But it does take a long time to build. And by the time they're done building it, 10 years from now, we're going to have all the solar you need. And the solar is going to be a lot less expensive. And also with nuclear too, there's the insurance, and people don't like living next to nuclear power plants, except for my very good friend, Homer Simpson. Do you know him?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely know about Homer and his job. All right. Thank you. So you kind of talked about how in the future you have worries of, what all these nuclear like extra stuff that material, extra nuclear material that they're just spilling out everywhere. Do you think humankind will be able to run off mostly renewable energy in the next 20 to 30 years?
I pretty much know it. I mean, a lot of people, even in the solar industry, are a little skeptical of that. But
Yeah.
I've lived off grid before. There's people that completely live off grid. And if they can do it, we can all do it. We can plug our cars in. We have the big solar arrays. The solar arrays are getting less and less expensive. If you do the work for yourself and use used equipment, and you got to be safe about it, I got to always mention that, got to be educated, but you can essentially do it for free almost. And the solar electricity has just gone way down in price. One of the things in the industry that we need to overcome is what they call soft costs. So it's like the cost of sales, the cost of permitting. There's a big movement in the industry to get rid of this bureaucracy, which sometimes costs more than the solar equipment.
All right. My next question is, how does renewable energy compare to nuclear energy in terms of cost efficiency, et cetera? You kind of already talked about this a little bit, but yeah, if you could explain a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that they argue about. And, it's like, I know right now, like solar's the cheapest, but it does depend on where you are.
Mm.
Because if I'm going to go up in the rainforest in Haines, Alaska, where I used to live, of course, there's not as much sunlight, but there's a lot of people there living off of solar energy. And, they don't have the same usage patterns and things like that. And it's hard to say how much a nuclear power plant, one of the things that's why it's hard to talk about that is from the beginning with nuclear power, they always said, oh, it's safe. And then something happens. And then it's like, well, we figured that out. It's safe. And then something happens like, okay, we figured that out. It's safe. And so when you say that, like after all these different accidents, and then they say, okay, this time now we got to figure it out. Now it's going to be really safe. And I kind of like, well, it's kind of easy to have a fusion reactor 93 million miles away and use magic crystals, that we stole from the aliens at Area 51. That's kind of a good way of doing it. I always joke around a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it takes a long time to build these nuclear power plants. You have to figure out how to distribute it. I know they're talking about using it for, the AI and the big NVIDIA chips and, all that kind of stuff. But we can do it with solar, we can do it with storage, and it takes a long time. And I can imagine like saying that how much paperwork is for a PV system put on your own house. What's it going to be for a nuclear power plant that takes 10 years to build? you
Yeah.
know. And it's like I actually flew, I do a lot of flying, and I flew over 3 Mile Island recently, and I was like, wow, that's crazy. That's right where it happened. And it was like kind of in an area where there's people and it's like, a lot of people live there and stuff like that. So, and it's like I hope the nuclear activists are correct and that it's going to be safe and all that kind of stuff. I really hope that. And another thing too is fusion, which is a completely different type of nuclear, and they're working hard on that. And and it's like taking a piece of sun and getting it on Earth, and so we don't have all the gravity of the sun and the heat. So we have to use lasers and things like that. And they might figure it out, but I think with solar, how it's not like a big, huge change overnight. With fusion, I don't think it's just going to be like all of the sudden it's like, whoop, got to find a new job.
Mm.
Like it'll be one of those things where when I'm 100 years old, I'll be like, yeah, it's starting to happen. It's just not one of those sudden things.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question to wrap it up is, What do you think is the biggest misconception that you run into about renewable energy, and how do you think it can affect people's perception on it?
One of the things is like the misconceptions is I think that people get political about it and they're like, oh, if this political side likes it, then that political side doesn't like it. And I think that it doesn't need to be that way. And I think it really isn't that way too bad. It's like a lot of people in the industry are surprised that I'm like, there's a whole lot of people on both sides in this industry. Um, and there's just one side that isn't as vocal, but there's a whole lot of people on both sides. And I wish just there wasn't these two sides too, that people would just be like meet and happy in the middle and things like that. And the other misconception that wasn't a misconception, like if you go read a book that's 10 or 20 years old, that misconception is going to be like, wow, this stuff isn't pay for itself. This is super expensive. There's no way we could power the world with this. Like you were saying, like, can we power the whole world with this?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Like it's happening right now. And if you look at those growth curves, it's just going to happen. We're going to have as much electricity as we need, and we're going to keep needing more and wanting to use more. And it's getting so inexpensive. It was like I can remember sitting in a talk and they were talking about bringing down the price of manufacturing costs of solar modules to $1 a watt. And this was probably like 2008 or something like that, I think. And everybody in the audience was like, yeah, that's a pipe dream. It'll never be $1 a watt. And I just read an article recently in PV Magazine, and it was about like somebody complaining that the price of solar might go back up to 12 cents a watt, and that's for like, the good crystalline silicon PV modules. And that's not the price that we get it here in the United States because we have tariffs, but we also have more expensive labor because we have to pay people to have good living wage and all that kind of stuff too. So it used to be that when you did a solar system, the majority of the cost of the solar system was the PV modules. And everything else, the inverters, the wires, the everything else was just like this little small fraction of the cost. And another thing that kind of blew my mind a couple of weeks ago is a friend called me. He's like, there's this PV system and I got to fix the roof and it's 20 years old and I got to figure out like what to do with it. And so the price of the system when it was installed was probably about $7 million or $8 million 19 years ago, $7 or $8 million. And now he's got to pay somebody $100,000 to take it away, to recycle it or do something with it, just to get rid of it. And it's kind of crazy. And so that's why I'm just saying that somebody could take those and do something with them. So there's a guy that I know, he's a electrician for movie sets, and he did his own tiny home. And he just goes down to the junkyard and, talks to the guy, brings home a truckload of modules that to me, it's like, that was a $50,000 system, and he gets them for free. And the guy at the dump doesn't have to, take those modules and try to strip the aluminum off and crush them up. And there's other ways to recycle them too. But it's like, what's better than recycling? Reusing. Reusing, I kind of look at it as a sort of recycling, but
Yeah.
if something works, it works. I see people too, they're like, oh, I need to get the latest. They think like upgrading a computer every couple of years, they try to like make that connection, but it's like, it works. It makes electricity. We can use the same sine wave of the alternating current that was 20 years ago, works just as well today. So
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you for letting me interview you. And thank you for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage podcast.
awesome. So yeah, thanks a lot. And let me see, how old are you?
I'm 17 right now.
Are you going to go to college?
Yeah, I'm planning on going to college.
You got like your applications all sent?
Yeah, I'm thinking about going to either Pomona or SJSU right now.
Okay, so that's Cal Poly Pomona. I used to date somebody from there, and she was in agriculture, and she had a shirt that said Cal Poly because they had a big agriculture program at the time. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then you San Jose State University. So that would be being a little bit closer to home here, over there in Silicon Valley and all that. So yeah, well, thanks for interviewing me, and thanks everybody else for listening.
Thank you, dude.